Tonight we're slipping into the warm glow of candlelight, where you find yourself in the hushed stillness of a medieval scriptorium. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, old vellum, and a touch of damp stone. You sit cross-legged on a wooden stool, your robes pooling at your feet, as a monk dips his quill into deep black ink. He hums softly off-key and scratches away at a sheet of calfskin with more patience than you've ever applied to anything in your life. Outside, the world may be dark and full of unknowns, but in here, a different kind of world is being made, one filled with rivers no one's ever seen, coastlines guessed by word of mouth, and in the margins, dragons. Real dragons, or at least real enough to someone squinting through candle smoke in 1325. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift closer to the parchment, watching as the map slowly takes shape. No Google Earth here. Just memory, myth, and whispers from seafaring guests who came in soaked, salty, and suspiciously dramatic. Every line scratched into this map is part speculation, part prayer, and part imaginative flair. You notice something curious right away. In the vast blank spaces beyond Europe and the Mediterranean, the monk doesn't leave it empty. No, that would be too honest. Instead, he sketches a half-coiled serpent, then beside it, something that looks like a lion, but with wings, obviously, and a fish tail for good measure. He scribbles some Latin beside it. You don't need to translate it to know the gist. Do not go here. Ever. See, in a world where most people never traveled more than 20 miles from home, the unknown wasn't just unknown, it was teeming with the unknowable. And mapmakers? Well, they filled that terrifying emptiness with creatures from whispered legends and bestiaries. Not because they believed in every beast, but because someone had to explain what lay beyond the last port. Better a dragon than a blank page. And let's be honest, if you had to choose between we don't know what's out there or there's a two-headed snake the size of a cathedral, which would you rather put on a map for your patron king? Historians still argue whether these illustrations were meant as warnings, decoration, or genuine belief, but in a way, it doesn't matter. What matters is how utterly human the impulse was. To fill space. To say, we haven't been here, but something lives there. And to make it large, scaly, and preferably breathing fire. You glance around the room. It's late. The other scribes are dozing at their desks, their candles guttering. One has fallen asleep face first into a diagram of the Levant, now smudged with forehead oil. Another snores softly into his ink pot. But your monk is still at work, unfazed. He's now drawing what looks suspiciously like a walrus in a bishop's hat. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe he's just bored. Maybe both. Here's the thing, in these early medieval maps, known as Mappa Mundi, accuracy wasn't really the goal. Orientation was symbolic. East was often at the top, because that's where Eden was believed to be. Jerusalem sat smack in the middle, radiating significance. And the further out you got, the stranger things became. Some maps included unicorns, cynocephali, dog-headed people, and literal fountains of youth. One popular theory suggests mapmakers relied on a chaotic cocktail of pilgrim stories, ancient Roman geography, and deeply questionable hearsay from spice traders who had absolutely no incentive to tell the truth. And let's not forget the noble art of flat-out guessing. Sometimes you wonder what it must have felt like to hold the world in your lap, in all its imagined glory. To believe that if you just inked it carefully enough, you could summon understanding out of fear. It's comforting in a way. Even now, in the age of GPS and satellite imagery, you still sometimes draw dragons over the parts of your own life you haven't figured out yet. In the corner of the scriptorium, a cat stretches lazily, knocking over a pot of gold leaf. No one reacts. The monk simply sighs and wipes it up with his sleeve. Gold's expensive, but so is time, and he's not about to redraw all of Byzantium. You lean back, blinking slowly, watching the map unfurl with every stroke. It's beautiful. It's absurd. It's the human imagination on full display, dressed up in robes and scribbled Latin. And if you listen closely, beneath the scratching quill, the breathing of tired monks, and the soft purring of a troublemaking cat, you can almost hear the echo of waves crashing against the edges of the known world. Out there, dragons wait. Or maybe just fog. Or icebergs. Or small islands full of confused seals. But tonight, in this candlelit room, they are dragons, and they are magnificent. You're still in the scriptorium, tracing the monk's progress as he leans in close to his parchment. But now, we shift just slightly closer to the origin of these odd beasts. You see, before the dragons ended up lounging in the margins of medieval maps, they had to be imagined somewhere first. And that somewhere, quite often, was the bestiary. A bestiary is basically a medieval animal encyclopedia, but instead of dry scientific facts, it's filled with wild interpretations, moral lessons, and creatures that range from vaguely plausible to completely unhinged. Want to read about a pelican that stabs its own chest to feed its young? It's in there. Fancy a glance at a bonacon, a bull-like creature that repels attackers by releasing flaming dung in their direction? Yup. Also in there. Your monk may not have traveled far, but he has read plenty. On his shelf sits a worn copy of the Physiologus, the your text of medieval zoological imagination. This book and its many descendants was copied, recopied, and translated across Europe, often with regional flourishes. A dragon in Normandy might look more like a giant chicken, while the ones in Sicily breathe real fire because the local volcanoes needed some sort of mythical PR department. Bestiaries weren't about zoological precision. They were tools for teaching virtue. Each creature came with a story, a lesson. The lion, who sleeps with its eyes open, that's Christ, always watching. The phoenix, resurrection. The owl, afraid of the light, that's a sinful soul avoiding truth. And the dragon, the dragon, almost always a symbol of evil, greed, or temptation. Great for sermons. Great for illustrations. Less great if you're trying to actually navigate the Black Sea. Still, these moralized monsters were wildly popular. Rich nobles commissioned illustrated bestiaries that glittered with gold leaf. Monks used them to spice up their otherwise painfully repetitive homilies. Kids probably giggled over the stranger entries, especially that one creature with a human face on its chest. Imagine trying to make eye contact with your own torso. Historians still argue whether mapmakers actually believed in these beasts or simply borrowed them for dramatic effect. But the lines between science, faith, and art were much blurrier then. Dragons weren't necessarily fake, they were just somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered, documented, or interpreted. You watch the monk flip through a few pages of his bestiary, muttering to himself as he decides what kind of dragon today's coastline deserves. A sea serpent with curling horns? A land dweller hoarding gold in a cave? Maybe both. After all, who's going to contradict him? His ink-stained finger stops on an entry that describes a dragon with wings like a bat and feet like a rooster. You blink slowly. That's not terrifying, it's almost adorable. Like a medieval chimera built by committee. But to the people of the time, these creatures weren't silly. They were symbols. They were stories. They were shorthand for "don't go here unless you're ready to fight your inner demons," or at least a fire-breathing chicken lizard. Even when dragons didn't show up in bestiaries, they haunted the margins of people's thoughts. Old Norse sagas, Greek myths, Arabic geographies, nearly every culture had some version of a giant reptilian beast guarding treasure, wisdom, or the edge of the known world. Sometimes, these creatures were based on mistranslations or misidentifications. A fossilized dinosaur bone? Obviously proof of a dragon. A large Nile crocodile glimpsed by a half-drunk crusader? Dragon. A rhinoceros seen from a distance and described by someone who's never seen anything larger than a goat? Also a dragon. And honestly, can you blame them? You've seen how even modern people get confused by a weird shadow on a trail cam. Now imagine trying to make sense of giant bones sticking out of the side of a cliff without any framework for extinction or paleontology. You'd assume dragon, too. You glance back at the map. It's starting to look like something real now, albeit something real that's been gently sprinkled with nightmares. There's a sea monster curled up near what might be the coast of India. There's a winged serpent loitering off the edge of Scandinavia, probably waiting for a Viking longship to get too close. The monk pauses, stretches his fingers, and glances over at the bestiary again. Then, with a satisfied grunt, he returns to his work. His dragon is not just a beast, it's a placeholder for mystery. For danger. For all the things no one wants to admit they don't understand. There's something oddly comforting about it. In a world that made very little sense, where plague could strike randomly, where war was more common than peace, where even the stars seemed to move just to confuse you, dragons were at least consistent. Big. Dangerous. Mostly outside your village. You rub your eyes and squint at the flickering candlelight. The room blurs a little. The monk keeps drawing. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the wooden shutters. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barks. You imagine it spotted something slithering past the edge of town. Or maybe just a sheep. Probably. But the map? The map knows better. Your monk dips his quill again, and this time his strokes are more confident. He's adding a tail. Not just any tail, a long, spiraling one that curls like an eel's, with jagged points along its spine. Because today's dragon isn't just decorative. It's territorial. It marks the edge of the known world. You lean closer and notice where he's placing it, right on the southern reaches of a large landmass labeled vaguely as Africa. Or maybe Libya. Or maybe just "Here be trouble." The lettering is inconsistent, but the intention is clear. This area is mysterious, dangerous, and probably home to at least 3 types of terrible lizards. But here's the thing. Medieval Europeans didn't have Google Earth, satellites, or even halfway reliable atlases. Much of what they thought they knew about distant lands came from a rich stew of travelers' tales, Roman writings, biblical allusions, and some downright spicy imagination. And when it came to the edge of their world, the dragons were the punctuation mark. Back then, cartographers relied heavily on a little trick, copy-paste. Well, not literally, but close enough. They'd borrow descriptions from older maps and accounts, embellish them a bit, and redraw them with flair. Pliny the Elder, a go-to source, even though he'd been dead for over 1,000 years. Herodotus? Absolutely. And don't forget those anonymous crusaders who wandered too far and came back with stories of men with dog heads, gold guarding serpents, and deserts that sang when the wind blew. These stories weren't dismissed. They were treasured, collected, recycled. By the time your monk sets his quill to parchment, He's working with a centuries-old game of historical telephone. One of the most influential contributions to medieval maps was a phenomenon called the Mappa Mundi, world maps drawn not to scale, but to reflect theological and symbolic priorities. The most famous of these, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, crams over 500 illustrations and references onto a single sheet, including unicorns, headless men, and of course, dragons. The east is at the top, where Eden sits, and Jerusalem is the center. Accuracy takes a nap while allegory throws a party. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood these maps as literal geography or as spiritual metaphors. Was the dragon in Ethiopia a real warning, or just a colorful way of saying stay humble, traveler? Honestly, it might have been both. In an age when church and science weren't enemies but uneasy roommates, one could believe in dragons while also believing in divine providence and the healing power of leeches. What's fascinating is how specific these beasts could get. For instance, medieval legends tell of a dragon in Ethiopia so vast it could eat an elephant in a single gulp. There's one near India whose breath is so foul it kills plants. Another in Armenia sleeps curled around a mountain pass, only waking when the scent of gold draws it from its lair. And while these tales often came secondhand, filtered through Arabic geographies like those of Al-Idrisi or Roman leftovers, they still ended up on European maps, often with captions like Draco Hic Estate or Beware the Serpent. You know, just in case you were planning a hike in Central Asia. But what really gives you pause is this: sometimes the dragons weren't even the scariest part. The maps also show lands ruled by cannibals, forests full of demons, and cities where people walked upside down. Compared to that, a dragon feels almost reasonable. At least it's got wings and a bit of charisma. Your monk, unfazed by such philosophical tangents, has moved on to outlining jagged coastlines. He's loosely sketching what might be the Horn of Africa, though the proportions are, let's say, optimistic. He adds a river, possibly the Nile, though it ends in what looks like a spiral, not a delta. And right near its mouth, another dragon. A smaller one this time, with tiny arms and what might be a monocle. Or a wart. Hard to tell. What is clear, however, is the purpose. Dragons aren't just creatures, they're cartographic commentary. They say, this part of the map, it's all guesswork. They whisper, tread carefully, or don't tread at all. And this wasn't a uniquely European habit, either. Chinese and Islamic cartography had their own flourishes. While less prone to throwing in mythological creatures, they still indulged in symbolism and imaginative leaps. Some early Islamic maps featured cosmological layouts with fantastical mountains. Chinese maps often included dragons, but as auspicious symbols of power and nature, not as territorial warnings. So why did European dragons end up looking like cranky snakes with wings? Probably a mix of biblical imagery, Greco-Roman lore, and pure artistic laziness. Drawing a fire-breathing gecko is quicker than rendering a realistic crocodile, and much more fun. You tilt your head, trying to follow the monk's logic. There's no scale, no compass rose, not even a clear indication of where north is. But there's definitely a narrative. This isn't a map for navigation, it's a story. A moral compass. A bedtime tale for travelers who can't sleep. You imagine a merchant from Genoa, unrolling one of these maps before his journey and seeing the dragon in the margin. Does he shiver, chuckle, or just shrug and pack extra garlic? The candle flickers low. The ink dries slowly. And still, the dragon waits. Your eyes follow the monk's hand as he dots the parchment with a cluster of bumps, tiny hills, pebbly islands. No, you realize, these are meant to be volcanoes. And not just any volcanoes. These mark the end of the known Mediterranean and the mouth of a far more treacherous unknown. To medieval minds, fiery mountains weren't just geological features, they were proof the earth had nerves, and dragons were often its twitchy muscles. As he inks the edges, the map shifts from geography into theatre. You notice a sea creature in the corner. It's not exactly dragon-like, more of a porpoise with a lion's manner and what appears to be a disappointed expression. This is the aspidocolone, a mythical sea beast so large it was often mistaken for an island. Sailors would land, light fires on its back, and then oops, it would dive, dragging ships and crew down with it. That tail? It pops up on more than one medieval map. And it's a good reminder, dragons weren't always scaly, winged, fire-spitting nightmares. Sometimes they were just misunderstood marine hazards with identity issues. At this point, it's worth considering how deeply medieval mapmakers depended on travelers for data. And by data, we mean wild tales collected at ports and monasteries, half remembered by sailors who may or may not have been drunk at the time. Marco Polo's accounts alone sent a generation of illustrators into overdrive. Did he really see dragons in the East? Probably not. But the way he described crocodiles in India, thick-bodied, fierce-eyed, fond of flesh, sure sounded close enough. Historians still argue whether Marco Polo exaggerated, mistranslated, or simply repeated local myths. What's certain is that by the time his stories reached a monastery in southern France, they'd been mixed with biblical beasts and Latin bestiaries until the crocodile had grown bat wings and a personal vendetta against humans. And so, the map fills in. What you're really seeing is a collision of sources: pagan, Christian, classical, and empirical. Take Isidore of Seville, his 7th century Encyclopaedia Etymologiae was used like a Wikipedia of its day. In it, dragons, dracones, are said to be so large they can coil around elephants and kill them with constriction. Yet, they're terrified of thunder. An odd weakness for a fire breather, but very on brand for medieval storytelling. Balance every horror with a bizarre flaw. As you trace the map's western edges, you reach the Atlantic. Or what they thought was the Atlantic. It's filled with whirlpools, dark storms, and islands that appear and disappear. One such island, St. Brendan's Isle, was believed to exist just beyond the edge of navigable waters. Brendan, a real monk from the 6th century, supposedly sailed west and encountered floating palaces, crystal towers, and you guessed it, dragons. Did it happen? Probably not. But it did get illustrated over and over again. Sometimes with Brendan looking impressively unbothered by the flaming lizard leering from a wave. In a sense, these mapmakers weren't so different from modern fantasy authors. They took known elements, the Nile, the Alps, the Caspian Sea, and built narrative bridges between them using monsters. Dragons were the connectors, the spice, the plausible deniability. Cartographic dragons also served a practical purpose: deterrence. Want to stop curious young monks or nosy nobles from questioning the unknown? Easy. Plaster the margin with beasts. It says, don't ask what's past this point. Just don't. You watch as the monk now turns toward the north. He begins sketching what might be Scandinavia long before it was well charted. In this version, it's a land of frost, perpetual twilight, and something with claws that lives beneath the ice. This isn't exactly a Viking, this is a worm, a snake-dragon hybrid with antlers and a craving for goats. Curiously, this region often contained another type of warning, not just dragons, but giants. Sometimes combined. What do you call a 20-foot tall, snow-dwelling serpent with tusks? In the Middle Ages, you called it a dragon. Or Tuesday. But not all cartographic creatures were hostile. Some were philosophical. There's a drawing on one 13th century map of a calm-looking dragon with a little scroll in its claw. Scholars debate whether this was a warning or a suggestion to read more. Either way, it's hard not to root for the dragon with literary goals. You glance back at the center of the map, Jerusalem. Always Jerusalem. In medieval cosmology, it's not just the axis of faith but the stable heart of a very unstable world. Everything dangerous, dragons, sea beasts, Amazonian warrior queens, even the dreaded Blemai, people with faces in their chests, gets pushed to the edges. And that's where the dragons live, on the margins. Not just of maps, but of thought. They are the personification of we don't know, and we don't want to find out. So, when your monk pauses, looks at his work, and adds just one more dragon, this time perched on a mountain labeled Gog and Magog, he isn't just doodling. He's contributing to a tradition of respectful ignorance. Saying, with ink and parchment, we got this far. Beyond that, good luck. The candle burns lower. Outside, a quiet breeze rattles a shutter. And on the page before you, dragons slither, coil, and curl into the gaps of human understanding. The map is nearly finished now, ink drying in delicate whirls, beasts in every corner, but your monk pauses once more, hand hovering above the northern coastline of Africa. You lean in. This part of the world has always held a particular fascination for medieval minds, not least because of how much of it was shrouded in rumor. And where there's rumor, there are dragons, or at least, their cousins. The Saharan interior, vast and golden, was often marked not with specific cities but with tantalizing symbols. A coiled serpent here, a sunburst there, and sometimes, curiously, a pair of giant bird wings. This wasn't accidental. In medieval maps, Africa was frequently depicted as a place of extremes, heat, mystery, and massive, misunderstood animals. Take the manticore, a personal favorite of many mapmakers. With the face of a man, the body of a lion, and a tail full of venomous spines, it was said to come from the deserts beyond Nubia. Of course, it didn't. But stories of lions, hyenas, and, according to one confused sailor, a smiling horse that eats people somehow morphed into this cheerful nightmare. Historians still debate whether these creatures originated from garbled accounts of actual wildlife, like cheetahs or baboons, or whether they were purely speculative filler for otherwise sparse regions. One theory: some of them were political commentary in disguise, creatures representing the wildness of lands outside Christendom. But let's not get too philosophical. You're still tracing the map, watching as the coast curves around to what they'd have called Libya, a name that, for many medieval Europeans, was synonymous with the entire continent. Here, a different kind of dragon begins to appear. Sleeker. Winged. Sometimes drawn mid-dive toward a herd of camels. These were the air dragons, less fire, more flair. They weren't just decorations. These flying dragons had a job: to explain sandstorms. Yes, truly. If a caravan vanished in a swirl of red dust, it wasn't the wind's fault, it was a sky serpent swooping low, stirring the air with its leathery wings. Medieval meteorology, folks. Not terribly accurate, but 100% memorable. And beneath that layer of whimsy, hints of real observation. A few mapmakers managed to include more realistic touches, date palms, river deltas, trade routes that actually existed. You wonder whether they ever wrestled with the contradiction, trying to represent both the known and the unknowable on a single sheet of vellum. Because here's the thing, mapmakers weren't just chroniclers. They were interpreters. Translators of a world that spoke in riddles and sandstorms, in sailors' yarns and scripture. And in doing so, They gave dragons a purpose far beyond fire-breathing theatrics. Dragons mark transitions not just from land to sea, but from certainty to speculation. You notice a line of dots leading down the coast, perhaps an attempt to mark the trans-Saharan trade. And next to it, a squat, wingless dragon with thick legs and a rather sheepish expression. This one, legend says, guarded gold mines. But instead of breathing fire, it sniffed badly. The stench was said to keep miners away unless they were very determined or very noseblind. Now, you may be thinking, surely no one believed this. Oh, but they did. For a while, at least. Enough that it became a fixture in texts like the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a wildly popular book full of true accounts that were 80% hearsay and 20% creative writing. His stories of dragon-guarded spices and odor-based defense mechanisms went viral, by medieval standards, anyway. Still, some readers were skeptical. Even back then, people rolled their eyes. Marginal notes in manuscripts include things like dubitata, doubtful, or, in one cheeky monk's case, a tiny doodle of a man plugging his nose. Yet despite all the exaggeration, these dragons reflect something deeper, or not just of nature, but of other people's nature. The further you got from Europe, the more magical or monstrous things seemed. And maps became less about direction and more about imagination management. This is where dragons really shine. Because they aren't just about fear. They're about possibility. What might exist? What could be waiting? What secrets the earth might still hold beneath dunes and jungles and skies? You return to the parchment just as the monk dots in a final beast near the Niger River. It's small, almost charming. A horned serpent, lounging beside what might be a baobab tree. No claws. No wings. Just a suggestion that something ancient and sleepy lives there, watching the world go by. And you know what? That feels right. Because even in the most fantastical medieval maps, there's this odd tenderness to the monsters. They're rarely just killing machines. They sleep. They curl around mountains. They occasionally smile. And perhaps that's the truest depiction of all. The idea that the world, especially its unknown parts, isn't just dangerous, but dreaming. You move eastward now, across the parchment, past the spine of the Nile and the mysteries of Africa's golden interior. The ink grows darker here, more deliberate. Your monk hesitates less, his hand steady as it approaches the Arabian Peninsula and Persia. There's confidence here. This part of the world was rich in stories, and medieval mapmakers adored stories. Arabia, in particular, was not just a land of sand and camels, but of knowledge and night creatures. You see, while Europe had been scribbling dragons into its margins, the Islamic Golden Age had been churning out astronomy charts, zoological encyclopedias, and travelogues filled with curious beasts and distant lands. European scribes didn't always understand these texts, but they borrowed liberally from them anyway. One result: a breed of dragon with academic credentials. These weren't fire-breathers hoarding treasure, they were desert lizards that dwelled in mountains of wisdom. One manuscript describes a serpent so ancient it had grown moss, and whose breath smelled of sandalwood. You don't know whether to fear it or invite it to a poetry reading. Still, not all the dragons here are so refined. Along the southern coast of Arabia, what we'd now call Yemen, lurks a creature with a split tongue and a weakness for pearls. Not for eating, mind you. For decorating its lair. According to one Venetian traveler, the locals told tales of sea serpents that slithered inland once a year to sunbathe, leaving trails of crushed oysters and, if you were lucky, a pearl or two. Historians still argue whether this legend was based on beached whales, snakes, or a merchant who just hated seafood. You can almost hear the cartographer muttering to himself, trying to remember whether the pearl-sniffing serpent lived near Aden or Muscat. He finally shrugs and adds it halfway between both, labeling it only with a squiggle and the word ignotum unknown. Practical. You notice another beast, coiled near the Persian Gulf. Sleek, with a long snout and multiple tails. Not quite a dragon, not quite a fish. In the margin, a note: these swim faster than ships and sing in storms. Possibly dolphins, probably sea serpent fever dreams. But it's a comforting idea, the notion that monsters might be musical. Moving inland, toward Persia proper, the map grows dense. Cities dot the terrain like grains of spice: Baghdad, Isfahan, Nishapur. Trade routes radiate like spokes. Here, dragons serve a different purpose. Instead of decorating the wilderness, they become border keepers. One text mentions a serpent of fire that guards the edge of civilization, a metaphor, perhaps, for where Persian influence faded into the unknown. Or maybe it was just a really dramatic way of saying beware bandits. You think back to the stories told along the Silk Roads. Merchants swapping rumors in dusty caravansaries. A dragon that melts gold into rivers. Another that sleeps for centuries beneath a salt flat, dreaming of cinnamon. The farther you travel into imagination, the more poetic the monsters become. And Persia had poetry in spades. Consider the Shahnameth, the great Persian epic. In it, dragons appear not as side notes, but as major characters. One in particular, Dahaka, is less of a dragon and more of a mythological catastrophe. With 3 heads, serpent shoulders, and an appetite for human brains, he was the kind of creature who made European dragons look like lazy lizards. Still, even he was defeated by a blacksmith. Make of that what you will. Historians still debate how much the Shahnameth influenced European mapmakers. Did they read summaries? Did crusaders bring back snippets? Or did the mere idea of a land with its own dragon canon seep into the collective imagination? Back on your map, the monk carefully inks a circle of mountains near the Caspian Sea. Inside them, he draws a coiled figure somewhere between snake and storm cloud. This, he writes, is the prison of Gog and Magog, those apocalyptic tricksters from biblical lore. Some maps show dragons standing guard at the gates, as if even chaos needs bouncers. You smile. The layers are stacking now. Dragons as symbols, metaphors, realish beasts, borrowed legends. And somehow, despite the chaos, it all fits. In the distance, the monk dips his pen once more. You follow, watching as he traces the edge of the Hindu Kush, hesitant now. The border between Persia and the next great mystery, India. You can already feel the shift coming. Your eyes linger at the map's new edge: India, land of elephants, incense, and, to the medieval European imagination, marvels that danced just this side of believable. You watch the monk's quill hover, then descend in tiny, careful strokes. It's here, in this shimmering land beyond the deserts, that dragon lore gets its most exotic facelift. To your cartographer, India is both known and unknowable. Thanks to Alexander's scribes, tales of India had filtered into the West centuries earlier. Later, Arab traders and Marco Polo gave the genre a flair for the theatrical. Combine that with hearsay, spice fumes, and a well-placed monastery rumor or two, and what you get is a land of sacred cows, pepper trees, and very philosophical dragons. Philosophical, because unlike their Western cousins, the dragons of India aren't always evil. Some are more like local deities, guardians of waterfalls, stewards of rain, coiled protectors of forest temples. You peer at one such creature painted with curled whiskers, a smile like a sleepy cat, and an elaborate crown. This is no snarling menace, it's a semi-divine serpent from Hindu and Buddhist lore. You might spot one lounging by a lotus pond, scales glistening, sipping dew, or winding around a temple spire, content to nap through centuries of incense and chants. They don't hoard gold. They hoard knowledge, weather patterns, and possibly long-forgotten bedtime songs. You wonder if they snore. The Ngas are a far cry from Europe's cave dwellers, and that's what makes this portion of the map so intriguing. Instead of warnings and exclamation points, your monk draws mandalas and script swirls. He even adds a little parasol above one serpent's head. Respectful. Regal. Possibly sun-sensitive. But not every tale from this region is so tranquil. There's the story of the Makara, often carved on ancient temples. A hybrid beast, half crocodile, half elephant, occasionally with peacock feathers thrown in for good measure. Historians still argue whether the Makara was meant to be terrifying or simply festive. One thing's for sure, it made for a fantastic boat ornament. And speaking of boats, let's not forget the Ganges. This mighty river, sacred and sprawling, was believed by some European mapmakers to be home to serpents longer than a fishing vessel and wiser than most bishops. One particularly poetic account describes a river dragon who drinks the moonlight and hums in Sanskrit. You're not sure if the scribe was sleep-deprived or just in love with metaphors, but either way, it made it into the margin. Further south, things get a bit experimental. One map labels a region with "Here be men who eat leaves and serpents who glow by night." Glow-in-the-dark dragons. Now there's a merchandising opportunity. A fringe travelogue claims these beasts guarded spice caves and were allergic to cumin. Another mentions flying snakes who vanish when looked at directly. Like reverse basilisk meets awkward dinner guest. But here's where the real mystery coils in. Some scholars point to the dragons of the Western Ghats, said to hibernate in stone hollows and awaken during monsoon season. There's no proof, of course, just oral traditions passed down and embellished. Yet even today, in certain villages, old folks will speak of strange shapes in the rain, of thunder that hisses, and of footprints that vanish in wet red soil. Historians still debate whether these tales came from sightings of massive pythons, overactive imagination, or one especially flamboyant peacock. But on the map, your monk draws 3 gentle swirls, each with a sleepy eye nestled in the curve of the mountains. Just in case. It's easy to get lost here, amid banyan trees and gold-laced temples. Your cartographer does too. You see him pause, blink slowly, then begin sketching a border of clouds. Not for decoration. For humility. India, he realizes, cannot be contained. So he writes a single phrase in Latin, Regio Miraculorum. Land of marvels. You nod. Seems fair. And just like that, your ink-stained path continues eastward, towards silk, thunder gods, and creatures who live inside clouds. The dragons are changing shape again. The wind shifts in your imagination, and the scent of spices fades into cool mountain air and faint whispers of thunder. Your monk drags his quill eastward again, past deserts and jungles, over Himalayan ridges so crudely drawn they look like dragon teeth themselves, until he arrives at the sprawling empires of China. Here, the map is less certain. Lines waver. Borders dissolve. And yet, despite the distance, medieval Europe had already built up an elaborate fantasy of the Far East, part curiosity cabinet, part fever dream. And at the heart of this imaginary China, dragons. Dozens of them. But not the kind you've met before. You trail your finger along a long, sinuous creature dancing through clouds. No wings. No fire. Just elegance. This is the long, not a monster, but an elemental force of balance and beauty. The Chinese dragon isn't just real to the people who imagine it, it's essential. It controls rain, rides the wind, and occasionally governs empires. One medieval map has a margin that reads, "Here reside the heavenly serpents who speak in thunder." Whether that came from a Buddhist scroll, a misheard trader, or someone who just really liked storms, we'll never know. But it stuck. Your cartographer, not entirely sure how to render such majesty, tries anyway. He draws a dragon with long whiskers, 5 toes, because he heard imperial dragons had more digits, and places a pearl just under its chin. You smile. Not bad for a monk who's never seen paper outside parchment. And unlike the shrieking WMS of Western Europe, these dragons bring rain to parched fields, patrol rivers, and serve as the zodiac's most flamboyant member. There's a sweet story scratched in faded ink near the dragon's tail of a boy in Sichuan who left rice cakes by a stream every spring, in thanks for the previous year's rain. Local farmers said it always worked. Historians still argue whether the cakes fed foxes, monks, or something with scales. Dragons here weren't feared so much as consulted. Emperors performed rituals in dragon robes. Cities built temples shaped like coiled serpents. And it was said that when a particularly wise ruler died, a dragon would come for his soul, curling through the mist like a silk ribbon drawn by wind. One fringe traveler, a Genos friar with extremely loose standards for what counted as first-hand, wrote that Chinese dragons sing lullabies to bamboo forests and sip lightning. You're 99% sure he was writing poetry, but your mapmaker didn't question it. Onto the parchment it went. Even more curious are the sea dragons said to dwell off China's coast. Descriptions vary wildly. Some are described like coral-covered serpents who weave between merchant ships, announcing their presence with bioluminescent bubbles. Others resemble whales with whiskers and surprisingly good posture. And a few legends describe dragons that wear clouds like cloaks, shapeshifters who teach fishermen to dream of stars. One oddly specific marginal note warns, "Do not insult a river. It remembers." Whether that's a proverb or travel advice remains unclear. The mapmaker adds a final detail: a round pond with lotuses and a dragon curled in its depths, eyes half-lidded, perhaps mid-nap. It's labeled Lake of Whispering Scales. No one knows which lake. Possibly none. Possibly all of them. You can almost hear the breeze over pagodas, the ripple of water, the soft clang of temple bells echoing through fog. Dragons live here, yes, but they're not beasts of terror. They're ancient weather patterns, guardian spirits, and yes, sometimes just excuses for a bad harvest. The dragon was moody this spring, someone might say, with a shrug and a teacup. And as you sit back, watching the painted clouds drift across parchment skies, you realize this is what separates Chinese dragons from their Western kin. They are not at war with humankind. They're in conversation with it. Your map stretches onward now, toward steppes, icy seas, and lands where dragons breathe not fire, but frost. The parchment grows paler as your gaze drifts northward, ink lines thinning like breath in cold air. Your mapmaker, bravely committed but definitely low on reliable sources, sketches in Siberia and the Arctic as best he can. Which is to say, not very well. Mountains resemble spilled ink. Rivers run uphill. And everything beyond a certain latitude is simply labeled "Here be cold." But in these white spaces, dragons take on stranger forms. Furred. Antlered. Sometimes eyeless. These are not the smooth-scaled serpents of China or the greedy wyverns of Western Europe. These creatures are colder, more cryptic, and absolutely uninterested in hoarding gold. Your monk pens a note beside one. The frost lurker appears only during sunless months. It hums through the birches. No one knows if he invented that or copied it from a traveler with severe frostbite. Doesn't matter. It's haunting enough to make the cut. One recurring creature in these northern regions is a kind of snow dragon, huge, pale, and silent. It doesn't fly. It glides across frozen lakes, trailing mist and setting off ice cracks that echo for miles. The local peoples, the Evenki and Yakuts, spoke of guardian spirits in the shape of great beasts with glacial breath. Some wore bells to alert them. Others simply stayed indoors on certain moonless nights. Historians still argue whether these stories referred to actual wildlife like giant sturgeon, or perhaps polar bears glimpsed through snowstorms, or if they were spiritual metaphors for winter's overwhelming presence. Either way, your mapmaker is fascinated. He draws a dragon coiled around a pine tree like a ribbon, scales suggested by small stars, and antlers like shattered glass. More fringe accounts mention that northern dragons didn't roar, they sang. Not operatic arias, of course, but low, rumbling harmonics that caused frost to bloom on windows and snow to fall in perfect silence. A wandering Danish bishop once wrote, "The dragon's sigh carries with it the scent of crushed pine and long regret." Theological implications unclear, but poetically strong. One particularly creative margin note tells of a Sami hunter who followed dragon tracks into the taiga, only to find an enormous crater where the ice had melted in a perfect circle. He left an offering, dried reindeer meat and a bit of spruce gum, and backed away without a sound. It was said his village didn't see a blizzard for 7 winters. On your map, your monk labels this zone land of the sleeping flame. It's ironic, considering how cold it is, but maybe that was the point, fire locked in ice, a dragon dreaming under the permafrost. Even the constellations get involved. Medieval scholars believed Draco, the dragon in the northern sky, spun slowly around the pole star like a celestial guardian. One amateur astrologer claimed it protected the Earth from sky foxes, which no one else mentioned, but which got a little doodle anyway, a fox with wings and a moon-shaped tail. Your mapmaker was nothing if not thorough. Then there's a strange mention in a Norse saga fragment, half lost to time, that describes the cold serpent who guards the Well of Echoes. Some think it refers to Jormungandr, the world serpent. Others think it was a metaphor for sound traveling across ice. Either way, it's mysterious enough to earn a spot. Curiously, the dragons of the north aren't always malevolent. They're often indifferent, distant, or mildly curious. One tale, jotted in a mix of Latin and Old Church Slavonic, describes a traveling monk who shared his campfire with a silent watcher beyond the tree line. No violence followed, just 2 shapes bathed in aurora light, keeping warm in companionable silence. This is the mood your map evokes now. Quiet, wide, icy, and somewhere out there, something massive and scaled moving slowly through the snow, minding its own ancient business. And just when you think your mapmaker might run out of ideas, he adds a final touch, a compass rose shaped like a coiled dragon tail, with icicles hanging from the tips. It points not to north, but to mystery. Because even in the quietest corners of the world, people found ways to believe something bigger might be watching, benevolent, bizarre, and just out of reach. You rest your fingers on the parchment again, and your eyes drift downward, southward on the map, into the lands where heat dances in waves, and ink smudges easily from the sweaty hands of uncertain explorers. This is where dragons begin to shimmer. Literally. Welcome to the deserts and savannas of Africa and the Middle East, where the dragons are often less scaly lizards and more strange amalgams of smoke, fire, and suggestion. Here, the edges of the map are drawn with trembling fingers, partly from the heat, partly from the fear of what lies just beyond the sand. Your mapmaker, likely never having set foot beyond the Mediterranean, draws from tales of merchants and pilgrims. He sketches an enormous dragon sprawled along the Red Sea, half serpent, half sandstorm. Its wings are dunes. Its eyes are twin suns. Below it, a tiny note in Latin, said to drink the sky dry and vanish at dawn. Historians still argue whether this was a metaphor for the Khamsin winds or a particularly vivid heat-induced mirage described by a disoriented crusader. Either way, it makes for a wonderfully dramatic monster. You can almost hear your mapmaker muttering to himself, "What does a desert dragon eat?" The answer, apparently, is camels, goats, and the occasional traveling bard. Though some stories claim it preferred silence to feasts, devouring only those who dared to sing in its domain. Down in the Sahel, stories from the Songhai Empire tell of giant river beasts with scales of bronze and voices like drums. One tale tells of a dragon who lived beneath the Niger River and controlled the annual floods, not with malevolence, but with a bureaucratic sort of rhythm. Offer a carved fish. The flood comes early. Offer nothing. The dragon sulks, and your crops wither. And of course, the Egyptian connection cannot be overlooked. The chaos serpent Apophis, said to battle Ra each night during the sun god's underworld journey, slinks into the margins of your map. Your monk, careful to avoid theological controversy, labels it as ancient serpent of eternal dusk, possibly retired. Respectful, if not entirely accurate. Further south, around the Horn of Africa, your mapmaker gets creative. He draws a dragon whose body is covered in mirrors, said to confuse hunters and make the sun burn twice as hot. Fringe travelers, likely shipwrecked and heat-stroked, wrote of being followed by a shimmering presence that whistled like boiling water. Was it a dragon? An angry sand dune? The effects of dehydration? Let's just say, historians still aren't sure. In the margins of the Arabian Peninsula, he scribbles notes about jinn, supernatural beings that, while not dragons per se, were often imagined with wings, flames, and mischief. One account tells of a jinn who borrowed a dragon's body to settle a gambling debt with another jinn. Your mapmaker adds a cartoonish puff of smoke and the words not technically a dragon, but spiritually similar. He isn't afraid to blend traditions. There's a Nubian legend of a giant serpent that wept molten tears when the stars fell. He places it near modern-day Sudan, curling through mountains, crowned with a halo of sparks. His caption: "Mourner of meteors." These desert dragons aren't gold hoarders. They don't nest in caves or kidnap princesses. They drift through heat and history, sometimes guardians of oases, sometimes the heat itself personified. Some are protectors, others merely indifferent presences keeping score in sand and shadow. You might even spot a tiny dragon perched atop a caravan trail, scribbled between palm trees and camels. It's holding what looks like a scroll and wearing spectacles. The caption reads, "Map reviewer. Critical but fair." Your monk clearly has a sense of humor, sleep-deprived, perhaps, but charmingly cheeky. And when it comes to the Sahara, the largest dragon yet dominates the topography. Its body stretches across dunes like an unfolding story. Too large to see at once, the margin explains, but its footprints are mistaken for dried riverbeds. He names it the Dust Sleeper. No one knows when it last woke. There's even a note added later in red ink. Some say the sandstorms are its breathing. Not exactly meteorology, but strangely comforting in its own logic. One story from Mali tells of a village that used to place painted stones outside their huts as offerings to a sky dragon who only visited during eclipses. The stones had to be round, cool to the touch, and completely smooth. Why? To remind the dragon of its lost eggs, said the tale. Whether this was symbolic of the moon or just a charming superstition, your mapmaker includes it, tucking a tiny ring of stones next to a dragon midyawn. And finally, just off the Horn of Africa, there's a drawing of an island that never existed, possibly Atlantis's sweatier cousin. At its center, a dragon made of obsidian and coral. It's labeled simply, unconfirmed. In these southern reaches, dragons aren't so much beasts as ideas, flashes of heat, whispered warnings, signs of power beyond human reach. They're less likely to roar and more likely to shimmer, distort, and vanish just as you draw near. And as the parchment curls at the edges from imagined warmth, your fingers trace the dragon's mirrored scales, reflecting your own sleepy face back at you. You lean back now, the map still unfurled before you, but your gaze drifts east, toward Asia, where dragons are less hunted beasts and more respected entities. And for medieval mapmakers, this region presents a delicious contradiction. Here, dragons are revered, yet still drawn with claws. Worshipped, yet still feared. A perfect puzzle for your ever-imaginative monk with a quill. Let's start in China. Unlike their fire-breathing European cousins, Chinese dragons are celestial, serpentine, and sophisticated. They don't kidnap maidens, they summon rain, balance the seasons, and offer luck to empires. That said, they also have a reputation for being, well, a bit particular. Your mapmaker has heard only fragments of Chinese cosmology, filtered through Persian traders and the ever-unreliable Marco Polo types. But he's impressed. These dragons aren't wild threats. They're governors of the elements. One controls rivers, another clouds, a third hibernates inside jade stones waiting for thunder. Our sleepy scribe draws one curled around the Himalayan peaks like a contented housecat, annotated, sleeps under snow, wakes to flood. Nearby, he adds a footnote, because even medieval monks appreciate trivia. Some say the emperor is born from its whiskers. Historians still debate what that meant. Possibly a misunderstood metaphor. Possibly very fancy facial hair. Moving south into Southeast Asia, things get even more interesting. In Vietnam, dragons help build the nation itself, descendants of gods and sea spirits. In one legend, a dragon and a fairy have 100 children, who go on to found tribes across the land. Your monk can't resist sketching this scene, tiny dragonlings clambering across mountains, their wings like banana leaves. One dragon curls protectively around rice paddies. The caption reads, "Guardian of grain. Likes flute music." That last part? Pure monk speculation, but somehow, you believe it. Further down the coast, near Java and Sumatra, he hears tales of the Naga, serpent dragons who live in underwater palaces and sometimes emerge to shape the fate of kings. These dragons are wise, but territorial. One story tells of a Naga who flooded a rival's village simply because someone stepped on its tail during a moonlit swim. The mapmaker, recognizing the importance of diplomacy, marks the coastline with little water droplets and the warning, "Don't splash loudly." And let's not forget India. There, dragons take on even more spiritual roles. Some are demon slayers. Others are world supporters. A few become metaphors for temptation, or for the cosmic energy winding through your spine. This is heavy material for your sleepy monk. So he draws a dragon calmly reading a scroll on a lotus flower. Caption: enlightened, allegedly. He also notes an old traveler's tale about a temple where monks fed mangoes to a golden dragon as part of a rain ritual. Modern scholars suspect the dragon was likely a very well-fed python. But who's counting scales when the mangoes are sweet? Turning north to Mongolia, your monk finds accounts of dragons as cloud spirits, horse-sized, pearl-loving beasts who ride the wind and decide where lightning will land. He sketches one floating lazily above the steppe, dangling a pearl the size of a haystack. A tiny nomad on a horse is drawn beneath it, pointing up in awe. The note, known to prank herders. And let's pause on that pearl for a moment. The dragon's pearl, a staple in East Asian lore, symbolizes wisdom, power, and sometimes, immortality. It's the one thing most dragons are shown chasing or holding. Your monk isn't entirely sure why, but he draws it with care, giving it rays like a tiny sun. Perhaps he imagines it's warm to the touch. Perhaps he's just really into circles. By now, your map is looking a bit crowded. So many dragons, so little parchment. But Asia isn't finished offering stories. In Korea, for example, dragons are seen as protectors of justice. There's a story of one who appeared in a dream to a king, offering advice on how to lower rice taxes. Your monk, impressed, draws that one in a scholar's hat, sipping tea. Caption: civil servant class. And in Japan, dragons get theatrical. One story tells of an 8-headed beast defeated by a sword-wielding god, each head lopped off with great ceremony. That's a bit too violent for our sleepy script, so your monk draws the dragon midnap, all 8 heads snoring gently on tiny clouds. Caption: only dangerous before breakfast. All these variations do something unusual for your mapmaker. They confuse him. Not in a frustrating way, more like a dreamy daze. In Europe, dragons are problems. Here, they're puzzles. Sacred, shape-shifting, sometimes invisible. It's hard to hate something that just wants to rearrange the rain. Historians still argue about how much of these Asian dragon depictions actually made it into medieval European maps. The Silk Road was long, translations were muddled, and monks were, quite frankly, overworked. But enough whispers made it through to alter the margins. So your monk improvises. He draws a great bridge stretching from Constantinople to China, made entirely of dragons holding tails. Across it walks a single pilgrim, staff in hand, heading toward the sunrise. Caption: not to scale, but spiritually accurate. By now, you can almost feel the heat of Mongolian steppe winds on your cheeks, smell the incense smoke curling around a golden Naga shrine, and hear the slow flap of jade-colored wings in the distance. And as the parchment curls slightly in the evening breeze, you trace your finger along a dragon's curling spine, realizing that here, at last, is a kind of map that doesn't lead anywhere but inward. You're still hunched over that curling parchment, eyes scanning the eastern horizons, but your curiosity itches westward now, toward Africa. The dragons drawn here are different. They shimmer less. They roar less. But they're no less intriguing. And for our sleepy mapmaker, they offer a rare challenge. How do you illustrate creatures born from stories that were never written down? Most of what he hears about Africa's dragons comes not from books, but from passing merchants, Berber traders, Tuareg guides, maybe a suspiciously well-traveled goat herder who insists he saw something glowing in the dunes. The tales are wild, scattered, and half-sung. Just the kind our mapmaker likes. First stop, the Sahel. There's talk of a massive serpent-like beast that coils beneath Lake Chad. It only rises once a generation, they say, to greet the stars, or perhaps to swallow a few unlucky fishing boats. Historians still debate whether this was a folk memory of Nile crocodiles, or a true dragon cloaked in silt. Your monk draws it as a long black ripple in the lake's center, with one sleepy eye barely open. Caption: don't row too loudly. Further west, among the Dogon people of Mali, he hears a curious myth. The world was created by a giant serpent that spun itself into a spiral and then sneezed out the stars. That's not easy to illustrate, especially when you've never seen a spiral galaxy, but your mapmaker tries anyway. The result looks vaguely like a cinnamon bun with legs. He gives it a dreamy caption: sneezed the sky. Avoid pepper. Heading south into the Congo Basin, things get wetter and stranger. Here, traders whisper of the Mokelmbembe, a creature part dragon, part sauropod, possibly part overactive imagination. Supposedly, it lives in the swamps and flips over canoes when in a mood. Western explorers would later romanticize it as Africa's answer to the Loch Ness Monster. But to locals, it's always been more than myth, something between a guardian and a test. The mapmaker, not wanting to cause offense, draws it with a polite smile. Caption: Swamp etiquette required. In Ethiopia, stories surface of winged serpents with jewel-studded hides that guard mountain passes. Some breathe smoke. Some breathe riddles. All of them are extremely territorial, especially during goat season. These might be echoes of earlier Egyptian tales, or newer hybrids inspired by Christian saints battling demons. Either way, your monk draws one perched on a rocky outcrop, tail wrapped around a weathered cross. Beneath it, a weary merchant trudges uphill. Caption: May ask you to solve a riddle before passing. Ah, Egypt. You'd think our mapmaker would be overwhelmed there, so much history, so many gods with animal heads, but is oddly calm about it. Perhaps it's the river. The Nile winds like a dragon already, and ancient Egyptians certainly embraced the image. They had Apep, the chaos serpent who tried to devour the sun every night. A monster not of fire, but of shadow and silence. Now, Apep isn't your average medieval dragon. No wings, no treasure hoard. Just an endless hunger for light. But your monk is fascinated. He sketches the serpent coiled beneath the horizon, fangs open, jaws like the darkened crescent of a lunar eclipse. Caption: Sleeps at dawn. Dreams of stars. Historians still argue whether Apep influenced European notions of hellmouths, those grotesque church carvings showing the damned being swallowed by giant mouths. The parallels are, admittedly, spooky. But our monk isn't drawing this dragon out of fear. He's drawing it out of awe. There's something noble about a creature that battles the sun every night, even if it always loses. Back in North Africa, he notes stories among Amazigh communities of flying serpents with feathers like peacock fans and a fondness for gold. They are said to nest in cliffside ruins, whispering secrets to travelers bold enough to climb high. Most never return. But a few come back speaking in tongues. Your mapmaker draws a feathered dragon yawning beside a tea set. Caption: Gossips in riddles. Possibly harmless. He also hears of dragons carved into the rock of Saharan oases, reptilian forms winding between palm trees and date groves. Some say these are just old crocodile depictions, warped by heat and time. Others swear they saw the stone blink. The monk sketches one near Timbuktu, blending into a mosaic of calligraphy and stars. Caption: Stone until sunset. What strikes you now is how many African dragons are shapeshifters, not just in form, but in function. Some are protectors. Others are warnings. A few might be metaphors for colonial confusion. And our mapmaker, to his credit, treats them all with respect. He doesn't label them monstrous or pagan. He just adds them to the map with the same gentle hand he gave to European wyverns and Asian noggers. There's even a sidebar on the map written in his flowing Latin shorthand that reads something like, "Many beasts dwell here, but perhaps none so strange as our own minds when they wander into the unknown." Now that's a bedtime-worthy musing if ever there was one. And now, with Africa's dragons winding in delicate ink across the southern half of the map, you feel a deeper texture settling in. This isn't just a record of where dragons live. It's a quilt of dreams, stitched together by whispers across trade routes, glances across language barriers, and one sleepy monk's careful hand. You trace your finger from the Nile to the Congo Basin, up through Timbuktu and across the Atlas Mountains, wondering how many stories have been lost, how many dragons slithered away before the ink could dry. And somewhere, just below the equator, one last dragon waits. No name. No caption. Just the faint outline of wings, half erased by time, hiding behind a smudge of desert dust. As if even the mapmaker wasn't sure what he'd seen there. Your gaze moves eastward again. Across the Red Sea, past Arabia's stony coastlines, through deserts stitched with spice trails and the occasional rogue camel, and into a place where dragons shed their skin entirely. Asia. The mapmaker knows this journey well, even if he's never left his monastery. His scrolls, gifts from traveling monks and worn-out merchants, are heavy with strange beasts and stranger philosophies. But the dragons of Asia? Oh, these are something else. To begin with, they're not always feared. In fact, they're often honored, even adored. Try wrapping your sleepy Western brain around that. A dragon as a symbol of rain, wisdom, power, and not even a little bit interested in hoarding gold. In China, for instance, the dragon, or long, is a dignified creature. Long-bodied like a snake, whiskered like your grandpa after a nap, and possessing a look of eternal bemusement. These dragons live in clouds, they say, governing rainfall and rivers. Without them, crops would fail and emperors would lose face. Naturally, the mapmaker feels out of his depth here. He tries to copy an illustration from a worn Chinese silk scroll. The dragon curves like a question mark across a mountain range, clutching a pearl. What's the pearl mean? Immortality? Wisdom? Historians still argue. The monk, unable to decode the footnotes, simply writes, carries a mysterious orb. Possibly very wise. He's especially interested in the idea of the 4 dragon kings, each ruling a sea, east, south, west, and north. He places tiny thrones in the corners of the known oceans, each with a different dragon lounging lazily like a cat who's just remembered it controls the tides. One even wears spectacles. Just because. To the south, in Vietnam, he hears tales of LC Long Quan, a dragon king who married a fairy and gave birth to the Vietnamese people. Your mapmaker tries drawing this as a family portrait. Dragon, fairy, and 100 kids fanned out like lotus petals. He adds a gentle note. The children later founded kingdoms. Probably argued over chores. In Korea, the emuji fascinates him. These are dragon-like creatures, serpent-bodied, rain-loving, who spend centuries striving to become full-fledged dragons. Think of them as dragon interns. The transformation, it's said, requires catching a yeoiju, a mystical orb that falls from the sky once in a blue moon. Some make it. Most don't. Historians still debate whether emuji were ever truly feared, or more like wistful metaphors for ambition. The mapmaker draws an emuji halfway through its transformation, half-scaled, half-cloud, nose pointed hopefully at the sky. He scribbles, "Be kind to aspiring dragons." You may be dozing off, but the ink still flows eastward. In Japan, dragons are less celestial and more tempestuous. Often tied to water again, rivers, oceans, monsoons, but also to shrines, spirits, and stories where they appear suddenly, offer cryptic advice, and vanish with the tide. There's Raijin, the sea dragon god, keeper of tides and magical items. One story involves him losing a jellyfish. It's a long tale. Your mapmaker gets lost around the part where someone wrestles a crocodile disguised as a flute. He draws Raijin looking slightly frazzled. Caption, "May lend you treasure. Bring snacks." He also hears whispers of female dragons, serpent goddesses who guard sacred springs or mountains. One, from the Ryukyu Islands, fell in love with a fisherman and lived disguised as a woman until her tail got caught in a door. The monk, blushing slightly, draws a dragon lady sipping tea, eyes narrowed. Caption, "Never ask about the tail." The dragons of Mongolia are different still, some connected to the sky, others to the underground. There's even a tale of a thunder dragon who lives beneath the Altai Mountains, and who roars every few decades just to remind everyone who's in charge. Your mapmaker doesn't quite believe it, but he still sketches a mountain with eyes. Caption: might snore thunder. And then there's India. Oh, India's stories are endless: rivers with souls, serpents with libraries, gods who ride dragons like Uber drivers. There's Vritra, a fearsome drought dragon slain by Indra, the storm god. That story feels more familiar to the monk, a bit more hero smites evil, but it's complicated. Vritra blocks rivers not because he's mean, but because that's his role. His order in the wrong place. Chaos disguised as control. Historians still argue whether Vritra was meant to be feared or pitied. The mapmaker draws him coiled across the Ganges, mouth open, tongue shaped like a question mark. Caption: thirsty? Blame this guy. He also learns of Ngas, serpent beings who dwell in rivers and underworlds. Sometimes divine, sometimes dangerous, always slippery. In Buddhist lore, some become guardians of sacred texts. Others just hang out under waterfalls, meditating. The monk imagines one with reading glasses and a bookmark. Caption: do not interrupt unless urgent. He hesitates to draw anything for Tibet. Too many mountains. Too many stories. Some of the dragons here seem made of wind and mantra, more idea than animal. But finally, he scrawls a dragon made of syllables, its body looping like a mantra. No caption this time. Just a pause. As if even he knows, not everything needs a footnote. By the time he's finished with Asia, the top half of the map is dense with loops, curls, and dragon tails that flow like rivers into mountains. You can barely see the land anymore. It's just dragons, dreaming over cities and deserts, lounging along coastlines like giant celestial cats. And somewhere in the margin, next to a barely legible drawing of a tea kettle, he writes, perhaps dragons are just stories with scales. You blink, breathing slower now. The dragons of Asia have no fire. No hordes. Just rain and patience, and maybe a tiny splash of chaos. You smile, eyes softening. It's starting to feel like these dragons don't need to be found. They've been here all along. Your mapmaker now turns westward, quill twitching in anticipation. He's crossed continents and followed dragon tails through clouds, caves, and curry-scented temples. But now, he wants to know, what did the thinkers, those Renaissance minds and Enlightenment eccentrics, do with all these dragons? You sit back as the pages turn toward a new age. Gone are the monasteries and smoky taverns. Enter salons, drawing rooms, and study chambers cluttered with telescopes and teacups. The age of reason has arrived, but it's not quite ready to evict the dragons. Take Konrad Gessner, the Swiss naturalist who, in the 1500s, thought it reasonable to include dragons in his zoological compendium, Historiae Animalium. He treats them like exotic snakes, sometimes winged, often fanged, and typically lonely. One of Gessner's dragons apparently lives in a cave near Lucerne and mostly minds its own business. Your mapmaker copies the image, labels it, shy Swiss dragon. Likely introverted. Then there's Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar who dabbled in geology, Egyptology, and just about anything that let him draw volcanoes. He theorized that dragons lived in fiery underground caverns connected by tunnels stretching across continents, lava-fueled dragon subways, essentially. Historians still argue whether he was serious, satirical, or simply sleep-deprived. The mapmaker is absolutely enchanted. He sketches little subterranean dragon stations beneath Europe, complete with a timetable. One dragon is running late, holding a coffee. Caption: delays due to magma. Meanwhile, In the Enlightenment, scholars begin to get suspicious. They dissect myths, compare fossilized bones, and write papers with titles like On the Impossibility of Flying Reptiles Breathing Fire. One particularly confident Frenchman declares dragons a hoax, likely cobbled together from crocodiles, snakes, and overactive imaginations. Your mapmaker reads this with a raised eyebrow. He responds by drawing a dragon made entirely of leftover lizard parts, a crocodile body, a goose head, raccoon hands, and bat wings. Caption: Skeptic's Dragon. As requested. Still, others aren't so quick to dismiss the beasts. Some point to strange fossils, huge bones unearthed in China, Europe, and North America. Could they be proof of dragons? The mapmaker learns that in China, ancient farmers often ground up dragon bones for medicine, now known to be dinosaur fossils. And in England, legends sprang up wherever enormous femurs poked through the earth. Were they the remains of fire breathers or just Pleistocene leftovers? He draws a dragon fossil being dug up by curious monks. One scratches his head. Another is trying to ride the bone like a horse. Caption: Archaeology in progress. You reach the 1700s, and mapmaking has evolved. Dragons no longer sprawl across blank regions. Instead, cartographers use tidy notations, here be shallows. Unsurveyed terrain. Dragons are replaced with sea depths and wind charts. But a few stubborn artists sneak them in, tiny, inked serpents coiled inside compass roses or playfully curled around map borders, like they're photobombing reality. Your mapmaker finds this delightful. He too begins to hide dragons, not as warnings, but as companions. A small one naps behind the Alps. Another lounges beside the Nile, tail dipped lazily in the water. One is reading a book upside down in the margins. Caption: Still learning. It's during this time that stories shift from warnings to wonders. Children's books start painting dragons as clever, sometimes silly, often lonely. The monk finds a dog-eared folio from the 1700s, a tale of a dragon who befriends a lost goat and opens a bakery. He adds a note in the margin: need more flour. He also discovers that some thinkers, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia, see dragons as symbolic. They represent greed, chaos, or nature's fury, depending on who's telling the tale. There's a theory, half scholarly, half poetic, that dragons are humanity's way of wrestling with the unknown, giving form to fear so we can sketch it, tame it, maybe even tickle it. Your mapmaker doesn't try to prove or disprove this. He simply adds a doodle, a dragon asleep on a pile of library books. Caption: Knows too much, naps anyway. By now, dragons aren't being erased, they're evolving. They sneak into naturalist journals, appear as metaphors in poetry, and lurk in the daydreams of painters. Even Napoleon supposedly had a dream about a glowing dragon curling around the globe. Historians still debate what it meant, some say it symbolized ambition, others say indigestion. The mapmaker draws this too, a dragon draped around the earth like a tired scarf. Caption: World domination requires naps. You realize now the shift that's happened. The mapmaker no longer charts dragons out of fear or warning. He draws them because they're part of the story, part of every culture's attempt to explain storms, shadows, or that uneasy feeling before dawn. Whether they guard gold or whisper rain prayers, dragons persist not because they're real, but because we keep dreaming them into reality. And that, perhaps, is the real magic. Not fire or flight, but memory, imagination. The shared lullaby of something large, scaled, and maybe kind, curled up just beyond the border of what we know. You shift slightly, blankets warm, breaths long and slow. The Enlightenment didn't slay the dragon. It gave it a library card. Your mapmaker's fingers pause, quill hovering above the parchment. He's come so far, from crude sketches on parchment scraps to elaborately detailed maps brimming with fantastical creatures and scholarly footnotes. Now he wonders, with so much charted, catalogued, and reasoned away, where did all the dragons go? It's a quiet question. And you can feel it too, a kind of hush. The maps today, sleek, satellite perfect, GPS stamped, don't leave much space for mystery. There's no "here be dragons" on Google Earth, no sea serpents lurking in weather apps. But the mapmaker knows better. He understands that dragons never vanished. They simply changed rooms. You trail him through the Victorian age, where curiosity cabinets are packed to bursting with narwhal tusks labeled unicorn horn and iguana skeletons draped with papier-mâché wings. One such curiosity, a baby dragon in a jar, really a taxidermied bat with a glued-on lizard tail. One delighted guest reportedly fainted. The mapmaker adds a doodle, a dragon in a top hat fainting at its own reflection. Caption: "Too handsome." This was the era of spectacle, after all. Traveling shows displayed dragon eggs alongside two-headed calves and singing fleas. And in literature, dragons enjoyed a full-blown renaissance. Enter Smaug, Tolkien's famously gold-loving reptile. The mapmaker sketches him sprawled over coins like someone guarding a suspicious crypto wallet. Historians still argue whether Tolkien's dragons drew more from Norse sagas or Beowulf, but your mapmaker doesn't split hairs. He simply notes that, for the first time in centuries, dragons weren't just feared or studied. They were beloved. He drifts further into modern times. A children's book lies open, A Dragon Afraid of the Dark. Next to it, a film where a dragon becomes a young Viking's best friend. A video game loads on a nearby screen. Dragons rendered in 3D flap across fantasy kingdoms, their roars echoing from flat screens and headsets. It's not lost on the mapmaker that the dragons now live in pixels, not parchment. But perhaps that's the point. They move where the stories go. And here's a curious twist. Despite all our satellites, we're still not done mapping. There are deep-sea trenches no light has touched, cave systems broader than countries, and jungles dense enough to hide football stadiums. NASA's ocean floor maps? Still patchy. And as for Mars, well, let's just say we've already speculated about Martian dragons in comic books. So your mapmaker continues to sketch, but now his map is stranger. More imaginative. It includes fictional worlds, mythic realms, and speculative futures. Dragons on exoplanets. Dragons made of stardust, curled up in nebulae. One is peacefully asleep inside a black hole. Caption: "Caution, very cozy, very dense." He looks up once, the room flickering with candlelight or maybe starlight. Around him, the world is quiet. Not because everything has been discovered, but because imagination hums in the background, like a lullaby you hum without noticing. And now, gently, he draws a final dragon. Not roaring. Not flying. Just curled up on a distant hill, watching the mapmaker draw. You realize then that this was never about dragons as creatures. It was about dragons as placeholders, for fear, for wonder, for things we're not ready to understand. Every "here be dragons" was a signpost for the unknown. And sometimes, not knowing is what makes things beautiful. He inks the final words beneath the map. Not a warning, not a legend. Just this. Some mysteries are meant to be dreamt. You let that line float in your mind as the wind down begins. And now, slowly, we begin to drift. The map lies still, parchment cool beneath your fingertips. The dragons, drawn in curled lines and gentle arcs, no longer guard or menace. They sleep. They wait. They breathe softly through the folds of history. Outside, a soft wind stirs imaginary leaves. Maybe it's just the fan you turned on earlier, humming with its usual lull. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the breath of something scaled and sleepy, settling in beside your dreams. There's nothing else to chart tonight. No more borders to ink or beasts to name. The stars overhead are steady. The corners of the map have softened. The unknown remains, but it no longer asks to be solved. Just savored. Let your thoughts slow to match the mapmaker's final stroke. Let your breath follow the rhythm of his dragon's slow exhale. The world, once full of wild terrain and sky-filling wings, narrows gently to the space you occupy now, pillows cool, sheets quiet, air easy. Whatever chased you today is behind you. Whatever waits tomorrow can wait. For now, you are exactly where you need to be. Right here. Still. Safe. And maybe, just maybe, curled up beside something old and kind, with a tale long enough to wrap you in calm. Sleep well, cartographer of dreams.